Irenaeus tells us that unity in truth is easy to obtain from the church, not from Scripture, but from the church. In fact, he brings up the hypothetical scenario of the apostles not leaving the church any writings. He sees the scenario as entirely plausible, as something that could have happened. And yet, does he freak out at the thought of having no New Testament scriptures? Not at all. He says in such a scenario that Christians could just follow the tradition handed down to those whom the apostles committed their churches to. Now, some Protestants try to argue Irenaeus is here just engaging in a thought experiment, that the church and apostolic tradition are what we'd have to rely on in the absence of New Testament scripture, but that since we do have New Testament scripture, we don't rely on the church and apostolic tradition, but on scripture alone. But that's not what Irenaeus actually says here. Before even bringing up the hypothetical scenario of no New Testament scripture, he says, if a divisive dispute arises among Christians, including about scripture and its interpretation, presumably, we can learn from the most ancient churches what is certain and clear, even when we do have New Testament scripture available to us. This is not sola scriptura, where scripture is sufficient, but rather an epistemology where the church and its apostolic tradition is sufficient, with or without scripture. That this is Irenaeus' point becomes even clearer when he goes on to talk about barbarians who become Christian without the benefit of any scripture because of apostolic tradition. This whole passage is a huge patristic death blow to sola scriptura. Irenaeus ends this section saying, thus, by means of that ancient tradition of the apostles, they, meaning the barbarians, do not suffer their minds to conceive anything of the doctrines suggested by the portentous language of these heretical teachers, among whom neither church nor doctrine has ever been established. The principle that scripture alone cannot unify is made clear also in another passage, where Irenaeus talks about how heretics abuse the scriptures, trying to support their errors based on scripture. And then, one proof that an idea is heresy or error is the fact that the fathers or originators of the heresies are themselves divided into various diverse errors, whereas the truth of the church is immovable and consistent. Where can we find both church unity and the truth of Scripture? Irenaeus quotes 1 Corinthians chapter 12, which we looked at earlier, where Paul talks about the leadership roles God has given his church. And Irenaeus says those who possess apostolic succession have received the gifts of the Lord, and thus we must learn the truth from them, since they preserve the faith and expound or interpret the scriptures to us without danger.